Hello out there, I'm the Oldest Nerd, and Past Tense, which is a two-part episode in Deep Space Nine, we've seen part one so far, is an interesting little thing for us to watch at this point, because at the time that the action takes place, for the most part, is what we would call the present day, but would have been 25 years in the future from the time that the show was done, and a good 300 years earlier than the Star Trek time period. So kind of three things that we're dealing with here in order to get a full grasp of watching this episode. What we find is that in this 2024 Earth, which by transporter accident and gobbledygook brought Julian, Dax, and Bashir to this dystopian Earth at this point, where there are required IDs and required transport papers and things like this in order to walk the streets. And if you couldn't produce this stuff, you were put into a sanctuary zone along with homeless people, or hopeless people for that matter. And they called those with mental problems the Dims, and those that were just out of work, the Gimmies. And so between and then the criminal element, which was not supposed to be in the sanctuary zones, they called the ghosts. And these are all crammed together into a zone that is too small for 10,000 people to be in, but it does get them away from all the proper folk who have jobs and walk the streets with their passes and papers and such. What's interesting to watch about this is that it says something about the fashions and technology that were predicted for 2024 back from the 90s. And the clothes would be considerably different than they were at the time, and they really haven't changed that much. That computers would be radically different, which they are, but not in the same way. And that the internet was expanded from what it was then, which is kind of accurate, but there are no cell phones, and there are no other high-tech things that you might expect in that in this time period. Nevertheless, they did a pretty good job guessing, I suppose, and the story that they're trying to say is that there was a pivotal point in history by a fellow by the name of Gabriel Bell, who led a riot in one of these sanctuary zones and caused more attention to be taken to these sanctuary zones in which people were just kind of thrown in to get rid of them. And with the sympathy that came from the general public, that was one of the major points that led to the creation of the Federation and essentially Starfleet. So without this happening, this would not happen. And so when Sisko and Bashir are put in this sanctuary zone, their main aim was not to be noticed, not to have anything that would change the timeline and therefore endanger their own existence. However, when Gabriel Bell is killed in a fight that would not have happened had they not been there, they realize that they need to do something about it. And Sisko takes along his identity as Gabriel Bell and proceeds to plan the riots as they begin before the ending of the first part. Now, meantime, on the Defiant, which is in orbit around present-day Earth, they find that suddenly they can't contact the Federation. There are no Federation satellites. There is no subspace radio. There's no other starships around. There's not the Mars colony. There's not the Venus terraforming or any of the other things that would be recognizable in 24th century space. So what we have is a situation to where Kira and O'Brien, and Odo, who are on the Defiant, need to find some way to travel back in time themselves in order to rescue our people. Now, we know that's going to happen in part two. That's a given. But what happens in this revolution, this riot, this what they call the Bell riots, is going to be instructive, and how Sisko is going to pull it off is going to be interesting. And while Dax was not put into one of these zones, she might have some knowledge of this period of history, having probably lived through it. However, she has found her way along the aristocratic circles and has used that in order to try to find her friends. And so at the end of this episode, Dax is on the cusp of being able to spring them out of this sanctuary zone, and the Defiant is on the cusp of being able to find them all and fix them. So the question is, does Sisko have time to correct history before all this happens? And that's, of course, it's a given that's going to happen, but how it gets there is always what's interesting. We have very good acting from Al Siddig. Also, we have good acting, of course, from Avery Brooks, as always, that we do, and from Terry Farrell, who has managed to be Dax and also masquerade as someone who is of that time, and does so better, of course, than Sisko and Julian do. So that's an interesting episode. It's one of the more watchable ones, just because it's interesting to see just how wrong they are in predicting what 2024 would have looked like. We know that the point in history has to be made up. Star Trek history has, including with the rise of Khan and the World War III, which should have happened in the 90s, did not. So this is an interesting little side note in Star Trek history, but an interesting projection by the producers as to what 2024 might look like. So I'd like to know what you think about it. Please put it in the comments below. And of course, we'll be back next week. And we're going to talk a little bit next week, I think, about Star Trek Prodigy. We're in the point of watching some of the episodes which dropped this week. And we'll be ready to give you kind of an overview of this season, which all dropped at once on Netflix. So we'll be talking to you about that sometime next week. In the meantime, thank you for joining us, and don't go far.